Well, we've reached the dramatic finale of the season of Epiphany, the Transfiguration of Jesus. As we've talked about in previous weeks, Epiphany is meant to be this gradual revealing of the nature and character of Jesus Christ, showing us who he is and what he's all about. The season is bookended with two similar stories, Jesus' baptism at the beginning and his transfiguration at the end. In both of these stories, a voice speaks from the heavens and declares Jesus to be God's beloved Son. But much like a reprise in a musical, the two are similar but not exactly identical. In the story of Jesus' baptism, the voice from heaven adds the line, "With whom I am well pleased." And in today's story, the voice adds the slightly more curt and direct line, "Listen to him." You can almost hear God's frustration, like, "I didn't think that I'd have to explicitly say this, but based off of my observations of you and your fellow disciples, I guess I was wrong, so let me spell it out for you. Listen to him." If we're being honest, it probably was something that Peter, James, and John really did need to hear. And I think that there are probably some modern-day Christians who need to be reminded to listen to Jesus as well, but that's another sermon entirely. There's a lot of implied references and meaning in this story that would have been pretty easy for Mark's original audience to recognize and understand, but for those of us reading this story some 2,000 years later, it can be a little more difficult. First and foremost, the fact that Moses and Elijah both show up is a big deal. It's a huge deal, really. These are two heroes of the faith, members of the Old Testament All-Star team, first ballot Hall of Famers. If there was a Field of Dreams game with Old Testament characters, these guys would be the captains. They represent the physical embodiment of the Torah, or the law, and the Nevi'im, the prophets, the first two sections of the Hebrew Bible. Their presence on that mountaintop alongside Jesus helps to establish his legitimacy as the fulfillment of the scriptures, and it signifies that Jesus is the next phase of God's revelation to the world. Revelation here meaning how God reveals herself, himself, themself, and how we come to know more about the nature and character of God, which ties us directly back to the whole point of this season of Epiphany. Additionally, Moses and Elijah each had their own mountaintop moments while they were still alive. Biblically speaking, the best, most likely place to encounter God is on top of a mountain. The Bible is full of stories of people traveling up mountains to pray and to talk to God. Moses, in particular, had a number of noteworthy mountaintop experiences. The burning bush incident happened on Mount Horeb, and he routinely traveled up to the mountaintops to talk with God throughout the Israelites' 40-year meander through the wilderness. The most famous one being when he climbed Mount Sinai and received the 10 Commandments, an encounter that caused Moses' skin to shine so brightly that others could scarcely look at him, much like how Jesus was transfigured in our passage for today. Elijah's mountaintop moment came in 1 Kings chapter 19. Just like Moses, he finds himself on Mount Horeb and is told to go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. The first thing that Elijah experiences is a wind that is so strong it is splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces. But God was not in the wind. After the wind came a mighty earthquake that shook the very foundations of the earth, but God was not in the earthquake. Then came a great fire, and God wasn't there either. But after the fire, God finally arrived in the sound of sheer silence. How many of you have had mountaintop moments in your life? moments where you were palpably aware of God's presence, where you felt overwhelmed by the divine, where you realized that you were standing on holy ground. What did it feel like? Did it fill you with awe or wonder, terror, amazement, a confusing and invigorating combination of all of those things and more? I can think of a few instances in my own life, and words often fail to fully describe what those moments felt like. Going to Muir Woods for the first time and standing under the towering redwood trees, gazing upon the stunning beauty of the Notre Dame Basilica in Montreal, where I had an accidental layover once, walking into the Maori Meeting House in the Field Museum in Chicago. Those mountaintop moments where we experience God can be beautiful and inspirational. They can sustain us through difficult times in our lives, reassure us of God's presence in our lives, help provide clarity and insight and direction. But they can also be somewhat misleading, because if we are not careful, we can begin to think that those are the only places and times where we can encounter God. That an experience of God like that is something that we need to seek out, to travel to, that we must go to a very specific place to find, because something that is that miraculous and spectacular could never happen in the midst of our mundane, boring, everyday lives, which just isn't true. Because as much as I experienced God at the Maori Meeting House inside the Field Museum, I also experienced God at the hot dog stand on the corner outside of that same museum, where they serve authentic Chicago dogs, and they make you dance if you want ketchup on yours. A number of years ago, in a magazine that I subscribed to called The Christian Century, there was an article about this very topic. Not the ketchup thing, but the how and when we experience God thing. The author was a mother of 3 young children, and she talked about some of the stereotypical advice that's out there in the world about how to develop your own personal spirituality, how to grow your faith life, and how to feel more connected to God. And she noted that it usually involved seeking out quiet and solitude, finding a way to get away from the hustle and bustle of life, away from the constant noise of social media and email and text notifications, away from the barrage of stimuli that we are subjected to on a minute-to-minute basis. After all, Elijah himself teaches us that God is not found in the noise of the wind or the power of the earthquake or the intensity of the fire, but in the sheer stillness of pure silence, which is all fine and good. But with 3 young children, she couldn't remember when she had last experienced a moment of pure silence. She also didn't really appreciate the advice that if you can't find those moments, you should make them by getting up 10 to 15 minutes earlier than you normally would. Because in her opinion, given her life circumstances, less sleep was never the solution to any problem ever. She wanted a God who was present in the messiness and the chaos of her everyday life. A God who didn't make her give chase, but would instead meet her where she was. And while we can, and certainly do, experience God in those profound moments of peace and stillness, those aren't the only places where such an encounter is possible. Because we do, in fact, have a God who is always moving towards us. A God who seeks not to be chased, but instead chases after us. A God who, rather than make us climb up the proverbial ladder of sanctification and get closer to heaven and be more like God, chose instead to become more like us and descend down to the earth, coming to us in the form of Jesus, the Word made flesh. We have a God who can be experienced in the mess and the chaos and the noise of our everyday lives, just as much as God can be found in the quiet tranquility of those mountaintop moments. which means that we can experience God in the middle of a forest as well as while we are waiting in line at the grocery store. The divine can speak to us out of the crashing waves of the ocean and in the honking gridlock of rush hour traffic. We might, prefer those more peaceful and majestic encounters, but we must remember that God is not absent from all of the other moments that make up our days. Which brings me to one final point about our reading for today. What do we do after we have experienced those God moments? Interestingly, Jesus swears Peter, James, and John to secrecy, instructing them not to tell anyone what they had seen. This is what is referred to by biblical scholars as the messianic secret, and it's one of the major motifs throughout the Gospel of Mark. Another example happens back in chapter 1 when Jesus heals a man with leprosy. The passage reads, "After sternly warning him, Jesus sent him away at once, saying to him, see that you say nothing to anyone." Now, there are lots of theories about why Jesus chose to take this approach with his ministry. Some think that this is one of the earliest examples of reverse psychology. Tell someone not to do something or that they can't do something, and that's all that they can think about doing, which is backed up by the fact that the guy who Jesus cured did not listen to him at all and instead went and told everyone that he could. There are others who claim that Jesus just didn't want his true identity to be known by too many people before the time was right. Regardless of his reasoning, though, it's important to note that Jesus' instructions to the disciples had an expiration date. He told them not to tell anyone until after the resurrection. And yet, even though all of us are obviously living in the time after the resurrection, how often do we tell people about our encounters with God? Whether they are mountaintop moments or they happen in the midst of the chaos of our everyday lives, how many of us share with one another the ways that God appears and speaks to us? Those of us who understand ourselves to be Lutherans, and yes, I know this is a Lutheran church, but I don't want to force any labels on anyone, but as Lutherans, we're really good at following Jesus' command. Well, the first part at any rate. God told us to listen to him, and he said to not tell anyone, so, hey, I'm just following instructions. And trust me, I'm calling myself out as much, if not more than anyone else, because I'm awful at telling other people about my encounters with God. In part because I don't always recognize them when they happen. I'm too caught up in my own worries and anxieties and all the stuff that I have to do and think about and accomplish that I just don't pay attention. But the ones that I do notice, you want me to do what now, God? You want me to talk about them? Like out loud? In front of other people? Please, anything but that. I mean, I can talk with all of you because you chose to walk through those front doors this morning, but to assault a poor innocent person out there in the real world with all my talk of religion, I don't want to force my faith onto anyone or make the incorrect assumption that they don't already have a faith of their own. Best to just keep those God moments to myself and save us all from a potentially awkward or uncomfortable situation, right? And yet, how can I keep such good news, the good news, in fact, how can I keep that all to myself when I know that there are people out there who desperately need to hear that they are made in God's image, that they are loved unconditionally exactly as they are, that God can find them at the ocean just as easily as God can find them waiting in line at Ralph's? How can we find ways to share our faith so that it doesn't feel braggy or boastful, but instead simply seeks to celebrate and give thanks through our witness? And do we even need to use words to share how God has been active in our lives? Can we tell of what we have seen and heard and felt through our actions, through who and how we choose to love, through what we do as much as what we say. As you can probably tell, I don't have all this figured out just yet. If any of you do, please let me know, and we'll get working on a book deal right away. I struggle, being mindfully present enough to recognize God's presence in my life. And then I struggle with how to go about sharing those moments with the people around me. But thankfully, that is exactly the kind of faith that God calls us to have. A faith that makes room for uncertainty, for struggle, for doubt. A faith that doesn't have everything figured out, but is open to learning, open to changing, open to one of those surprise mountaintop moments happening when and where we would least expect them. This week, I'd like you to tell one person where or how you experienced God in your life recently. And don't worry, it doesn't have to be a stranger, but tell somebody. Tell somebody about that rainbow that you saw. I saw like 6 on my drive into work on Wednesday alone. Tell them about how the sun broke through the clouds and shone through your window at just the right angle to fill your room with light. Tell somebody about your morning that was full of chaos and love as you tried to get your kids off to school. Let's practice this whole talking about God thing, because the more we talk about it, the more we'll be on the lookout for it. Plus, you never know who might really need to hear that good news. Amen.
Amen.